My name is David, and for 40 years of my life, I was a devoted Jehovah's Witness. 40 years. That's longer than many people live their entire adult lives. I was an elder, I served at Bethel, I was a circuit overseer for 3 years, and I believed with every fiber of my being that I had found the truth. But one simple question changed everything, and what happened next shocked me to my core. Let me take you back to the beginning. I was just 19 when I first encountered the witnesses. My family wasn't religious, but when two well-dressed men knocked on our door one Saturday morning in 1983, something about their message resonated with me. They spoke about paradise on earth, about a time when there would be no more suffering, no more death. As a young man dealing with the typical struggles of finding direction in life and watching the world spiral into what seemed like increasing chaos, this vision of hope was exactly what I needed to hear. The man who studied with me was named Robert. He was in his 40s, confident and knowledgeable, with a gentle but authoritative way of explaining complex biblical concepts. Every Tuesday evening, he would come to our house with his well-worn Bible and the bright blue truth book, and we would sit at our kitchen table discussing prophecies and promises that seemed too good to be true. I remember the night I decided to get baptized. It was during a circuit assembly, and the speaker was talking about the urgency of the times. He said that Armageddon was so close that young people my age might not even finish college before the end came. The fear and excitement I felt in that moment was overwhelming. I didn't want to be destroyed with the wicked world. I wanted to survive into the new system and help rebuild paradise on earth. Within 8 months, I was baptized in a concrete pool at a district convention, along with 52 other candidates. I'll never forget the feeling as I went under that water, believing that I was symbolically dying to my old life and being resurrected as one of God's chosen people. When I came up, gasping and wiping the chlorinated water from my eyes, I felt like I had been reborn. Within a year, I was pioneering, spending 90 hours a month going door to door, sharing what I believed was the most important message in human history. I carried a leather book bag filled with Watchtower and Awake magazines, books like The Truth Shall Make You Free and You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth, and a well-marked Bible with hundreds of yellow highlighted verses. I threw myself into the organization with the passion that only a young convert can possess. I studied every publication, attended every meeting, and followed every direction from the governing body without question. I memorized entire presentations for the Theocratic Ministry School. I could explain the 1914 chronology using 7 different Bible prophecies. I knew the names and faces of all the members of the governing body and considered them my spiritual fathers. By my mid-20s, I had married Sarah, a pioneer sister who shared my zeal for the truth. We met at a circuit assembly, introduced by mutual friends, who thought we would make a good match. Our courtship was chaperoned and brief, conducted according to the organization's strict guidelines. We were married 8 months after our first date, in a simple Kingdom Hall ceremony with no wedding cake, no dancing, and no alcohol, all things that were considered inappropriate for Christian weddings at the time. I was appointed as a ministerial servant within 2 years of my baptism, and as an elder by the time I was 28. This was considered quite young for such a responsibility, but I had demonstrated exceptional dedication and knowledge of the organization's teachings. I took my role as a shepherd seriously, spending countless hours preparing talks, conducting judicial committees, and shepherding the flock. Sarah and I were the perfect witness couple. We hosted book studies in our home every Thursday night, welcoming 15 to 18 publishers who would squeeze into our living room to study the latest Watchtower publication. I would lead these studies, carefully preparing questions that would help the group understand and apply the spiritual food provided by the faithful and discreet slave. We gave talks at circuit assemblies, usually demonstrations about witnessing to different types of people. I remember one particular talk we gave about preaching to someone who believed in evolution. I played the householder while Sarah played the zealous witness armed with a creation book, ready to demolish any argument for evolution with scientific evidence that proved God's existence. We were held up as examples to younger ones in the congregation. Newly married couples would come to us for advice. Single brothers would ask me about reaching out for privileges in the congregation. Young sisters would ask Sarah how she had found such a spiritual husband. Our entire social circle consisted of witnesses. Our recreation, our entertainment, our goals in life, everything revolved around the organization. I remember the pride I felt when Sarah and I were invited to serve at Bethel in 1992. This was the ultimate honor for a young witness couple. We would be working directly for Jehovah's organization, helping to produce the literature that would spread the truth worldwide. We sold our small house, gave away most of our possessions, and moved to Brooklyn, New York, where we would live in a small room at the headquarters complex. For 3 years, I lived and worked at the headquarters, and I loved every minute of it. I worked in the service department, helping to handle correspondence from congregations around the world and assisting with the Circuit Overseer program. I felt like I was on the inside of God's organization, privy to the processes by which spiritual direction was given to the worldwide brotherhood. The routine was structured and purposeful. We woke up at 6:30 a.m. for personal study and meditation. Breakfast was served at 7:30 in the large dining room, where hundreds of Bethelites would gather to eat and fellowship. Work began at 8 a.m. sharp, with a brief prayer and the day's text discussion. I would spend my days reviewing letters from elders describing congregation problems, helping to draft responses that would provide scriptural guidance, and working on materials for circuit overseer visits. The sense of purpose was intoxicating. I believe that every letter I helped to answer, every piece of guidance I contributed to, every policy I helped to implement was part of God's plan to shepherd His people before Armageddon arrived. I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, something eternal and meaningful. Evenings were spent attending meetings at the local congregation or participating in Bethel activities. Monday nights were family study, where all the Bethel family would gather in the auditorium to consider a Watchtower article together. Tuesday nights were the theocratic ministry school and service meeting at our assigned congregation. Thursday nights were often used for additional meetings or special events. Saturdays were for field service, and Sundays were for the public talk and Watchtower study. The social aspect was wonderful. I was surrounded by people who shared my beliefs, my values, my dedication to the organization. We would have game nights, go on group outings to museums or parks, and share meals together in the small dining rooms scattered throughout the complex. It felt like living in a spiritual paradise, a foretaste of what life would be like in the new system. When Sarah and I returned to our home congregation in 1995, we were viewed with a special reverence. We were the couple who had served at Bethel. Young people looked up to us, and we took that responsibility seriously. I was immediately reappointed as an elder and given additional responsibilities. We counseled engaged couples about the importance of putting kingdom interests first. We helped struggling families by sharing the practical wisdom we had gained from living in a communal setting. We were always available when other elders needed assistance with difficult situations. Within 3 years of our return, I was recommended to serve as a circuit overseer. This was an even greater honor, a position that would allow me to shepherd multiple congregations and work directly with the branch office in implementing organizational direction. Sarah and I sold our house again, gave away our remaining possessions, and began traveling from congregation to congregation in a small motor home provided by the organization. For 3 years, I served as a circuit overseer, visiting 20 congregations twice a year and conducting circuit assemblies. I gave talks to thousands of publishers, conducted elder schools, and helped to resolve complex judicial matters. I felt like I was at the pinnacle of organizational service, a direct representative of the governing body to the publishers in my circuit. The years flew by. Sarah and I raised our 2 children, Michael and Rebecca, in the truth. They were born into the organization, raised from infancy to view the Watchtower Society as God's visible organization on earth. They attended meetings from the time they were babies, sitting quietly through 2-hour assemblies and 3-day conventions. They learned to read using Watchtower publications. They made their first friends in the Kingdom Hall. Michael was baptized at 16, Rebecca at 15. Both decisions filled me with pride and joy. I believed that I had successfully passed the truth on to the next generation, that my children would survive Armageddon and live forever in paradise because of the choice I had made to become a witness all those years ago. Michael was appointed as a ministerial servant at 21, and Rebecca pioneered after graduating from high school. She had been accepted to college, but chose to forego higher education in favor of full-time preaching, a decision that I strongly encouraged. I was proud of her for putting kingdom interests first, even though a small part of me wondered what she might have accomplished academically. We were living the witness dream. Our family photo could have been on the cover of a Watchtower magazine. We looked happy, spiritual, unified in our dedication to God's organization. But even in paradise, there were moments of doubt that I quickly pushed aside. The first crack in my faith came in 1995, when the organization changed its teaching about the generation that would see Armageddon. For decades, we had taught that the generation of 1914 would not pass away before the end came. This teaching had created a sense of urgency that drove much of the preaching work and had been a cornerstone of our eschatology. I remember reading the new explanation in the November 1st, 1995 Watchtower and feeling confused. How could something that had been taught as absolute truth for so many years suddenly be wrong? As an elder, I was expected to help others understand this new light, but I struggled to explain it convincingly even to myself. The new explanation seemed forced, as if the writers were trying to solve a problem rather than explain a scriptural truth. I had given countless talks explaining the old understanding, had used it in field service presentations, had counseled young people to avoid pursuing careers because the end was so close. Now I was supposed to teach something completely different, as if the previous teaching had never existed. But I pushed the doubt aside. I had been taught that the faithful and discreet slave class would receive new light as God revealed his purposes progressively. If they had received new understanding about the generation, then I needed to accept it and help others to do the same. Other small doubts began to surface over the years. The blood policy that seemed to have more exceptions every year, making it increasingly difficult to explain coherently to new ones. The way certain questions were discouraged, even labeled as dangerous thinking. The increasing emphasis on obedience to the organization rather than personal Bible study and meditation. During elder meetings, I noticed how any questioning of organizational policies was quickly shut down. We were reminded that we were not policy makers, but policy implementers. Our job was not to understand every decision, but to support it loyally. This attitude troubled me, but I told myself that it was necessary for unity. The way certain scriptures were explained seemed forced, as if the interpretation was being made to fit a predetermined conclusion rather than being derived from the text itself. The constant emphasis on loyalty to the organization, even when it meant going against one's own understanding or conscience, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. I had been taught to trust the organization above my own understanding, so I did. Whenever doubts arose, I would pray for help to overcome them. I would study the publications more diligently, hoping to find answers that would satisfy my concerns. I would talk to other elders about my struggles, and they would remind me that we needed to wait on Jehovah, that all things would be made clear in due time. It was during the 2019 regional convention that I first heard the talk that would plant the seed of my eventual awakening. A governing body member was giving a talk about the importance of loyalty to the organization, even when we didn't understand certain decisions. He used the example of the Israelites following Moses in the wilderness, emphasizing that questioning leadership was equivalent to questioning God himself. Sometimes, the speaker said, God's organization might ask us to do things that don't make sense to our imperfect human reasoning. But we need to remember that Jehovah sees the bigger picture. Our job is not to understand every decision, but to obey faithfully, trusting that God will bless our loyal submission. Something about that analogy bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. As an elder, I had always been taught that we should test all things, that the Bereans were commended for examining the scriptures to verify Paul's teachings. So why was questioning now being portrayed as a lack of faith? The speaker continued, In these last days, we can expect Satan to use every means possible to undermine our faith in God's organization. He might plant seeds of doubt in our minds, make us question the wisdom of the faithful and discreet slave, or tempt us to rely on our own understanding rather than the guidance we receive through the publications. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was my questioning really coming from Satan? Was my desire to understand rather than simply obey a sign of spiritual weakness? As an elder, shouldn't I be setting an example of unquestioning loyalty? That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my Bible, not a Watchtower publication, just my Bible, and I read the account of the Bereans in Acts chapter 17. The more I read, the more confused I became. These people were praised for not taking Paul's word at face value, for searching the scriptures daily to verify what they were being taught. They were commended for their noble-mindedness, not criticized for their lack of faith. If this was the example we were supposed to follow, why did questioning the organization's teachings make me feel guilty? Why was independent thinking portrayed as dangerous when the Bible seemed to encourage it? Over the next few months, I found myself paying closer attention to things I had previously accepted without question. During elder meetings, I noticed how any suggestion that deviated from organizational policy was quickly dismissed. We were reminded repeatedly that we were not policy makers, that our job was to implement decisions made by those taking the lead. I started noticing how often we were told not to research outside sources, not to read material that might undermine our faith, not to associate with former witnesses who might plant seeds of doubt. These warnings had always seemed like loving protection from Satan's influence, but now they seemed like attempts to control information and limit critical thinking. The breaking point came during an elder meeting in March of 2020. We were discussing how to handle a brother who had been asking questions about the organization's handling of child abuse cases. The circuit overseer, who was visiting that week, made a statement that made my blood run cold. "Brothers," he said, "even if the organization made a decision that seemed wrong to us, we should support it anyway, trusting that Jehovah would correct any mistakes in his own due time. Our loyalty to the organization is more important than our personal understanding of any particular situation." That statement hit me like a physical blow. I sat there in that Kingdom Hall back room, surrounded by men I had worked with for decades, and I realized that what I was hearing was not faith, it was blind obedience. I thought about the millions of people throughout history who had suffered and died because they followed human leaders without question. I thought about the responsibility each of us has to use the mind and conscience that God gave us. The circuit overseer continued, "We might not always understand why certain policies are in place, but we need to remember that the faithful and discreet slave has access to information and insights that we don't have. Our limited perspective might make their decisions seem unwise, but we need to trust that they are being guided by Holy Spirit." I looked around the room at the nodding heads, the approving murmurs, the faces of men who seemed completely comfortable with the idea of surrendering their critical thinking abilities to a group of men in New York. How had I been one of those people for so many years? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that statement, about the implications of what was being taught. If we were supposed to follow the organization even when we believed they were wrong, how were we any different from any other high-control group? How was this different from the blind obedience that had led to some of the darkest chapters in human history? I decided I needed to research the organization's history more thoroughly. As an elder, I had access to older publications and internal documents that regular publishers never saw. I started with the organization's own historical materials, books and magazines from the early decades of the Watchtower Society. What I found shocked me. The early witnesses had believed and taught things that were now considered apostasy. They had celebrated Christmas and birthdays well into the 1920s. They had saluted the flag and served in the military. They had allowed blood transfusions and organ transplants. Most shocking of all, they had taught that Jesus had returned invisibly in 1874, a date that was later changed to 1914 without any explanation to the membership. I read about Pastor Russell's failed predictions for 1914 and how the organization had claimed that Armageddon would come in 1915, then 1918, then 1925. I learned about Judge Rutherford's transformation of the Bible students into Jehovah's Witnesses, and how he had introduced many of the organization's most distinctive doctrines based on his own interpretations rather than careful biblical exegesis. I read about the flip-flops on major doctrines. The superior authorities of Romans 13 going from worldly governments to God and Jesus in 1929, then back to worldly governments in 1962. The generation that would see Armageddon being redefined multiple times as the predicted dates came and went. The changing understanding of who the faithful and discreet slave was, and when they were appointed. Each discovery was like a punch to the gut. How could the one true organization be wrong about so many fundamental teachings? How could God's channel of communication be so inconsistent? I remembered being taught that truth doesn't change, that God is not a God of confusion. But what I was seeing was an organization that had been wrong about almost everything at one time or another. As an elder, I had access to internal letters and documents that revealed even more troubling information. I learned about the organization's relationship with the United Nations, something that seemed to contradict everything we had been taught about the UN being the disgusting thing that causes desolation. For 10 years, from 1992 to 2001, the Watchtower Society had been a registered NGO associated with the UN Department of Public Information. I read confidential letters about child abuse cases that had been mishandled, about the two-witness rule that had allowed predators to continue abusing children because their victims couldn't produce a second witness to corroborate their testimony. I learned about legal settlements that had been paid out to abuse victims, money that came from donations given by sincere publishers who had no idea how their contributions were being used. The more I researched, the more questions arose. I started reading material that had been written by former witnesses, people who had been disfellowshipped or had left the organization voluntarily. For years, I had been told that such material was spiritually dangerous, that it was designed to undermine faith and lead people away from the truth. But what I found were thoughtful, well-researched critiques that raised legitimate concerns about the organization's teachings and practices. I felt like I was living in two different worlds. During the day, I would conduct elder meetings, give talks from the platform, and shepherd the flock as if nothing had changed. I would counsel publishers about the importance of loyalty to the organization, enforce policies I was beginning to doubt, and participate in judicial committees that might disfellowship people for asking the same questions I was asking in private. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I had built my entire identity around being an elder in God's organization. My friends, my family, my sense of purpose, my understanding of reality itself, everything was tied to my position in the organization. The thought of losing all of that was terrifying. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unknow what I now knew. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe these were just growing pains, imperfect humans doing their best to understand God's will. Maybe the mistakes of the past didn't invalidate the truth of the present. Maybe God was using the organization despite its flaws, the way He had used imperfect people throughout history. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this explanation didn't hold water. If the organization was truly God's channel, wouldn't He protect them from teaching false doctrine? Wouldn't they be more reliable, not less, than secular sources? How could the faithful and discreet slave be so consistently wrong about so many important matters? For months, I wrestled with these questions alone. I couldn't talk to Sarah about it because I knew she would be devastated to learn that her husband was having doubts. As an elder's wife, she had built her identity around supporting my role in the organization. If I lost my position, her entire social standing would disappear as well. I couldn't talk to my children because I didn't want to stumble them. Michael was working toward being appointed as an elder, and Rebecca was serving as a regular pioneer. Their entire social lives, their career prospects, their romantic relationships, everything depended on their standing in the organization. I couldn't bear the thought of destroying their faith and leaving them with nothing to replace it. I couldn't talk to my fellow elders because questioning the organization was tantamount to apostasy in their eyes. I had seen what happened to elders who expressed doubts too openly. They were first counseled, then removed from their positions, then eventually disfellowshipped if they didn't recant their concerns. Once disfellowshipped, they became non-persons, treated as if they were dead by everyone they had ever known in the organization. The isolation was crushing. I would sit on the platform during meetings, giving talks about loyalty and obedience, feeling like a fraud. I would participate in field service, sharing beliefs I was no longer sure I held, trying to convince other people to join an organization I was beginning to doubt. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the fear of what would happen if I spoke up. It was during this time that I started having panic attacks. I had never experienced anything like them before. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, unable to breathe, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. I felt like I was drowning, caught between the life I had always known and the truth I was beginning to see. The physical symptoms were terrifying. My hands would shake when I gave talks from the platform. I would break out in a cold sweat during elder meetings when organizational policies were discussed. I started having trouble sleeping, eating, concentrating on daily tasks. I knew I needed help, but seeking therapy was generally discouraged in the organization unless it was for clearly medical issues. I finally decided to see a therapist, telling Sarah that I was struggling with anxiety related to the stress of elder responsibilities. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I found Dr. Rodriguez through a referral from my family doctor, and I was careful to choose someone who had no connection to the witness community. Dr. Rodriguez was patient and understanding. He helped me work through the concept of cognitive dissonance, explaining how the mind struggles when faced with conflicting beliefs and evidence. He didn't try to influence my religious beliefs one way or another, but he helped me understand that it was normal and healthy to question things that didn't make sense. "David," he said during one of our sessions, "you spent your entire adult life in a system that told you what to think, what to believe, how to act. It's natural that learning to think for yourself would be uncomfortable and scary. But that discomfort doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're growing." Through therapy, I began to understand that my worth as a person wasn't tied to my position in any organization. I started to rediscover parts of myself that I had suppressed for 40 years. I remembered that I had once been interested in science and philosophy, subjects I had abandoned because they weren't encouraged for witnesses. I remembered that I had enjoyed debating ideas and exploring different perspectives, something that had been discouraged as prideful thinking. But even as I began to heal emotionally, I still felt trapped. How do you leave a position you've held for decades? How do you walk away from your family, your friends, your entire support system? How do you start over at 59 years old with no skills outside of religious work? The answer came in the form of a single question, asked at the worst possible time. It was during a circuit assembly in September 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic had forced the organization to move all meetings online, but by fall, they had started holding small, socially distanced assemblies for individual circuits. I was giving a talk about the importance of trusting the governing body even when their direction didn't make sense to us. I was using the example of Naaman, who was told to wash in the Jordan River 7 times to cure his leprosy. The point of the illustration was that Naaman had to follow instructions that seemed pointless in order to receive his blessing. In the same way, I said, we must follow the direction we receive from God's organization, even when it doesn't make sense to our imperfect human reasoning. But as I spoke these words, I couldn't help but think about all the failed predictions, all the changed doctrines, all the evidence I had uncovered about the organization's history. If the governing body had been wrong about so many things in the past, how could we be sure they were right now? How was blind obedience to imperfect men any different from the kind of mindless following that had led to historical tragedies? I continued my talk, emphasizing that questioning the organization's direction was a sign of pride and independence. Satan wants us to think we know better than the faithful and discreet slave, I said. He wants us to trust our own understanding rather than the guidance we receive through God's organization. But we must resist these prideful thoughts and submit ourselves humbly to theocratic direction. Even as I spoke these words, I felt sick to my stomach. I was teaching things I no longer believed, encouraging people to surrender their critical thinking abilities, promoting the same blind obedience that I had come to recognize as dangerous. During the question and answer portion of the program, a sister in the audience raised her hand and asked a question that would change everything. Brother Williams, she said, I've been thinking about your illustration of Naaman. But what if the person giving us direction isn't really from God? How can we tell the difference between faithful obedience and blind following? The question hit me like a lightning bolt. Here was someone else who was struggling with the same doubts I had been wrestling with for months. I looked out at the audience, seeing hundreds of faces waiting for my response, and I realized that I couldn't give the standard organizational answer anymore. I stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I could give the expected response about trusting the faithful and discreet slave, about not leaning on our own understanding, about the dangers of independent thinking. But I couldn't bring myself to say those words, not when I no longer believed them. Instead, I heard myself saying something completely different. That's an excellent question, sister. And I think the key is in what you said about telling the difference. If we're supposed to follow the governing body even when we think they're wrong, how is that different from what Jonestown followers did when they drank the Kool-Aid? The silence that followed my question was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that assembly hall. Hundreds of faces turned to look at me, most showing shock and horror. The circuit overseer, sitting in the front row, went pale. My fellow elders on the platform looked like they had been struck by lightning. But I wasn't finished. 40 years of suppressed questions came pouring out. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We've been wrong about so many things in the past. The generation teaching, the blood policy, the dates for Armageddon. If we were really God's channel, wouldn't we be more reliable? How do we know when we're following God and when we're just following men? The murmur that went through the assembly hall was like a wave. People were whispering frantically to each other, some standing up as if to leave, others staring at me in shock. The circuit overseer stood up and walked quickly toward the platform, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Brother Williams, he said firmly into his microphone, I think we need to take a brief intermission. But the damage was done. I had asked the forbidden questions, the ones that exposed the dangerous nature of blind obedience. I had compared the organization to a cult, and in front of hundreds of witnesses, while wearing the badge of elder authority. Sarah was sitting in the front section reserved for elders' wives. Her face was white with shock, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. Our children, sitting nearby, looked mortified. Michael's face was red with embarrassment, while Rebecca looked like she was about to faint. During the intermission, I was immediately surrounded by the other elders and the circuit overseer. They ushered me into a back room where I was peppered with questions about my spiritual condition, my loyalty to the organization, and my fitness to continue serving as an elder. "Brother Williams," the circuit overseer said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger, "what you just did was unconscionable. You've undermined faith in God's organization in front of hundreds of people. Do you realize the damage you've done?" I tried to explain my concerns, to share what I had learned about the organization's history, but they wouldn't listen. Every point I raised was dismissed as Satan's lies. Every question I asked was labeled as prideful rebellion. These men I had worked with for decades looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if I had become something dangerous and contaminated. We didn't return to the assembly program. Sarah and I were sent home immediately, and I was told that a judicial committee would be formed to deal with my apostasy. Word was already spreading throughout the circuit about what had happened. The drive home was silent except for Sarah's occasional sobs. How could I embarrass her like that? How could I make such a comparison? What were people going to think? What were our children going to say? How could I throw away 40 years of faithful service for the sake of asking rebellious questions? "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked when we finally got home. "Do you understand that you've just committed apostasy in front of hundreds of people? Do you know what this means for our family, for your position as an elder, for our children standing in the congregation?" I tried to explain my concerns, to share what I had learned about the organization's history, but she wouldn't listen. Every point I raised was dismissed as Satan's lies. Every question I asked was labeled as prideful rebellion. The woman I had been married to for 37 years looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if I had become something dangerous and contaminated. That evening, our phone started ringing constantly. Text messages began pouring in. Some were from concerned friends asking if I was okay, but most were from people expressing their shock and disappointment. Fellow elders from around the circuit were calling, asking to meet with me as soon as possible. I knew what was coming. I had seen it happen to others who had questioned too openly, who had stepped outside the bounds of acceptable thinking. I was going to be disfellowshipped, and my family would be required to shun me. 40 years of faithful service would be erased, and I would become a non-person in the eyes of everyone I loved. The judicial committee meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. As an elder myself, I knew exactly what would happen. 3 elders would sit across from me at a simple table, not as my friends, but as judges, representatives of an organization that valued loyalty above truth. Those few days between the assembly and the meeting were some of the darkest of my life. I barely slept, barely ate. I kept thinking about all the people I would lose, all the relationships that would be severed. My children would be forced to choose between their father and their faith. My grandchildren would grow up not knowing me. My friends of decades would treat me as if I were dead. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. The secret was out. I no longer had to pretend to believe things I doubted. I no longer had to live a lie. Whatever happened next, at least I would be authentic. The night before the meeting, I made a decision. I wasn't going to apologize for asking honest questions. I wasn't going to pretend that my doubts didn't exist. If they wanted to disfellowship me for seeking truth, then so be it. I walked into that Kingdom Hall back room on Tuesday evening with my head held high. 3 elders sat across from me at a simple table: Brother Peterson, a man I had served with for 15 years; Brother Martinez, whom I had personally recommended for appointment, and Brother Thompson, the presiding overseer, who had been a close friend for over a decade. These were men I had worked with, laughed with, shepherded alongside for years. We had conducted judicial committees together, made decisions that affected people's lives, and supported each other through difficult times. But their faces were cold, formal. They weren't my friends anymore. They were judges. Brother Peterson opened the meeting with a prayer asking for God's guidance in dealing with my apostasy. Apostasy. Before I had even spoken, I had already been labeled. The prayer was long and detailed, asking for wisdom to help me see the error of my ways and return to the truth. They asked me about my questions at the assembly. They asked me if I still believed that the governing body was God's faithful and discreet slave. They asked me if I was willing to accept counsel and change my thinking. I answered honestly. I told them that I believed every human organization was fallible, including the Watchtower Society. I told them that I believed every person had a responsibility to use their God-given conscience and reasoning ability. I told them that blind obedience to any human authority was dangerous and unscriptural. Brother Martinez, whom I had mentored when he was first appointed as an elder, looked at me with a mixture of sadness and disgust. "Brother Williams," he said, "you're speaking like an apostate. Do you realize that?" I looked at him calmly and replied, "If asking honest questions and refusing to check my brain at the door makes me an apostate, then I guess I am one." The meeting lasted 4 hours. They tried everything they could think of to get me to recant, to admit that I was wrong, to agree to keep my doubts to myself. They quoted scriptures about submitting to those taking the lead. They reminded me of my 40 years of faithful service. They appealed to my love for my family, warning me that disfellowshipping would destroy my relationships with my children and grandchildren. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back to living a lie, pretending to believe things I knew were false, supporting an organization whose history was built on failed predictions and changing doctrines. "David," Brother Thompson said during one of their final attempts, "you've been a faithful elder for over 30 years. Don't throw all of that away now. Can't you just keep your doubts to yourself? Can't you support the organization even if you have some questions about specific teachings?" I shook my head. "Brother Thompson, if I discovered that a medicine I was prescribing to patients was actually harmful, would you want me to keep prescribing it just to maintain my position as a doctor? That's what you're asking me to do spiritually. You want me to keep quiet about serious problems I've discovered, to pretend everything is fine when I know it isn't." In the end, they had no choice but to disfellowship me. The announcement would be made the following Thursday. "David Williams is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses." Those 8 words would erase 40 years of my life and make me dead to everyone I loved. Sarah filed for separation within a month. She said she couldn't live with an apostate, that it would harm her standing in the congregation and set a bad example for other families. The woman who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, abandoned me because I had asked questions she was afraid to consider. My children stopped speaking to me. Michael actually crossed the street to avoid me when he saw me at the grocery store one day. Rebecca sent me one final email. "Dad, I hope you know what you've thrown away. You've lost your family for nothing." But she was wrong. I hadn't thrown anything away, and I hadn't lost everything for nothing. I had gained something infinitely more valuable than the approval of an organization. I had gained my integrity. I had gained my authentic self. I had gained the right to think freely and question openly. The transition wasn't easy. Learning to live outside the organizational bubble after 40 years was like learning to breathe underwater. Everything I had known about how to live, how to socialize, how to find purpose, was tied to being an elder in God's organization. I had to rebuild my life from scratch. I moved to a different city where no one knew my history. I went back to school and got a degree in counseling, something I had always been interested in, but had never pursued because secular education was discouraged. I started working with a non-profit organization that helped people recover from trauma and rebuild their lives. Slowly, I began to build new relationships with people who valued me for who I was, not for my religious position. I discovered that there were good, moral, loving people outside the organization, something I had been taught was impossible. I learned that purpose and meaning in life didn't require membership in any particular group. Most importantly, I learned to trust myself again. For 40 years, I had been taught that my thoughts and feelings were unreliable, that I needed an organization to think for me. Breaking free from that mindset was one of the hardest but most liberating things I've ever done. It's been 4 years since that fateful question at the circuit assembly. 4 years since I lost my family, my friends, my entire social world. But in those 4 years, I've built a new life, one based on authenticity rather than blind faith. I still miss my children terribly. Not a day goes by that I don't think about them. Don't hope that they'll one day find the courage to reach out. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael is struggling with depression and that Rebecca's marriage is in trouble. I want to be there for them, but I know that as long as they remain in the organization, I'm forbidden to them. If you're reading this and you're struggling with doubts about your own beliefs or organization, I want you to know that it's okay to question. It's okay to think for yourself. It's okay to trust your own mind and conscience. You have the right to seek truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient. That one question changed my life forever. It cost me my family, my friends, my sense of security, but it also set me free. And freedom, I've learned, is the most precious gift we can give ourselves. The truth will set you free. But first, you have to have the courage to seek it.